I'd like to tell you about a story, a kind of a sad story about someone for whom it took 5 years to get hold of the inheritance that his mother had left him. Might be hard to believe, but some people whose estates are not really well organized leave money to their kids, or they think they're leaving money to their kids, and they have no idea the extent of the trouble that they've created for their children to get access to the money because they didn't set things up right. So in this case, what had happened is this woman had passed away, and she wrote a will. And there's several problems happening. There was this nexus of her estate, in which we all realized, boy, was this thing not well planned. So first thing is, she did have a will, which is good. The problem is she wrote the will herself and did not have a lawyer help her do it. Therefore, when the will was ultimately probated, the court was not so happy with it and, in fact, threw it out. So now her son had to come along and take care of it. Now, what was the problem? Her son was a nice man, but not so talented with legal issues, didn't have much experience with money. And in fact, the second problem, which I think the mother had really caused, was she never taught her son about proper financial maintenance. She never went over what she had with him. She didn't discuss what issues there were. So she never taught him about finances. And what did she expect? When the time came for him to actually deal with it, he had no idea. And so, like many people, he rolled himself up into a ball, climbed into a shell, and just stayed there for about 2 years. At that point, he said, "Oh, where's my money?" And then he began to get interested, and he realized he had to do something. He didn't know who to work with. He worked with someone who just wasn't even qualified. Eventually, he ended up talking to a lawyer. The lawyer referred him to us. We began to tell him that the steps that he needs to take to do it, but there were certain things that he had to do. I'm going to tell you in a minute what some of those things are. Eventually, he got through the whole process. 5 years later, it took him 5 years to get the money. Can you imagine? That's, for me, the craziest story that I've ever heard. I've heard people, it takes a long time, things aren't so organized, but that was the worst when I was ever personally involved where I saw it happen. So I'd like to first explain how this situation could have been avoided in this guy's case, because maybe we can retrospectively solve his problem. And in discussing this, I hope you'll take away a few ideas that you can do, and I'll try to summarize, and I'll give you a little bit of information that'll help you get organized. So the first thing is, the woman who wrote the will absolutely should have spoken to the lawyer, to a lawyer, at least one. Why? Because she lived in Israel and her assets were mostly in America. So at least you should realize you're dealing with a slightly more complicated issue than when you lived in America. And I know there's lots of will templates you can download from the internet. So you download something and you fix it up a little bit and you sign it. Well, Israel, for example, where the wills generally are going to be probated, is not just going to accept that. There's all sorts of rules and regulations that lawyers in Israel are well trained to deal with, hopefully, and they should be able to at least walk you through it. Now, I don't mind if people do research on their own. And in fact, I always encourage clients, before you go speak to your lawyer, think about what you want. Because if he's a good lawyer, the first thing he's going to say to you is, well, if you die, where do you want your money to go? That's not the time to begin deciding, do I want it to go to this kid or that charity? Just write it down on a scrap of paper. I have 6 kids. I want each one to get, I want each one to get 1/7, and the other 1/7 I want to go to charity. For example, if that's what you want, write it down. Prepare the names of all the children, their Teudat Zehut numbers, their Israeli identification numbers, their social security numbers. Get that information so it's all ready. Had this woman spoken to someone here, I presume a lawyer would have advised her to do that. He would have made sure that she kept the will relatively simple. He would have also made sure that she properly signed it and that it was properly taken care of. So that's one. That's on her side. On her son's side, what he should have done is, as soon as he realized there was a problem with the will, he should have gone to a lawyer who could have then actually probated the estate without a will. What does it mean to probate? When you probate it, it basically means you're going to the court and saying, so-and-so died. I need you to give an okay that the estate can now be passed along to the heirs. So in most cases that I've seen, and unfortunately in the 30 years that I'm in business and basically dealing usually with elderly people or older people, people have died on our watch, right? This is what happens when you deal with older people. Eventually they pass away. Most of the time, it goes relatively smoothly. The heirs take the will to court. And by the way, for the assets that are in brokerage accounts and IRA accounts and that we deal with, bank accounts, that kind of thing that we're dealing with in America, an Israeli will is just fine, works no problem. So the heirs, they go to court in Israel. The judge looks at it, he does whatever he has to do. Not long after, we get an order of probate, and we're able to begin the process of distribution of assets to the heirs. Not a big deal. So in this case of our story of this man who didn't quite get there, he could have said, okay, I have a will that's not working, right? It's basically not a will because it's not being accepted by the court. Let's go through the procedure of someone who dies intestate. Intestate is the word for someone who dies without a will. Now, Israel, like all places, I think, has regulations for what happens if someone dies without a will. Generally, a topic that you may hear people talking about is they'll say, well, if there's a family and let's say the father dies and he has no will, so half the money goes to his wife and half the money goes to his kids. Is that really what you want to happen? Probably not. You probably don't want half the money to go to your wife and half the money to go to your kids. Maybe you do, but frankly, I don't think I've ever seen someone want that. But if that's the law, that's what's going to happen, unless you have a will that says something different. In fact, I knew a case not so long ago where the father died pretty young. It was sad, and it was a surprise he was still working, and he had no will because, like 50-something-year-olds, he thought, I'll deal with this when I'm 80. Boy, he really should have dealt with it, because it turned out that according to the law, half the money went to his wife, half the money was to go to his kids. And the wife, needless to say, was very unhappy about this. And the children thought, well, maybe our father meant that. And this created a huge rift in the family that took a long time to settle. You know, as I'm telling you this story, I'm thinking of another story of a husband who died intestate. And he, apart from the assets, he and his wife jointly owned a house. So basically, he owned half and she owned half. And they had little children, not grown-up children, little children. So what happened? What did the court say? They said, okay, well, the house is, I'm not talking about the other assets. The court said, well, according to Israeli law, because he had no will, half the house goes to the wife and half the house goes to the children who were minors. Now, can you imagine dealing with the legal complexities of that? If she wants to sell the house, how do you do that? Imagine the costs, just the costs of the legal, of hiring lawyers to help you deal with the fact that you don't really own the house that you and your husband lived in for many, many years. Your kids own part of it. And now, anyway, it's beyond the scope of our discussion today. If you send me an email and say you really want to hear all the details of the story, maybe I'll bring the lawyer on and we can have a discussion about it if this is relevant. But the solution to this is just write a will. Absolutely, the situation would have been avoided had someone written a will with the help of a lawyer. That didn't happen. This man should have gone to the court and dealt with it right away. He also, he should have dealt with what's called a transfer certificate. So probably you've never heard of a transfer certificate. Most people haven't. A transfer certificate is just a letter, basically, from the IRS that says that the deceased, the person who died, does not owe any taxes, and says to the bank or the brokerage firm, you can release this money to the heirs. So this is very, very important, because the IRS, when someone dies, it's kind of the last chance they have to get taxes from him. So they don't want the banks and the brokerage firms just to quickly release the money to everyone until they've had a chance to review the situation. So right away, what this man should have done is he should have applied to the IRS or had his accountant do it, because it's not super complicated, but it's a little bit complicated. And recently we had a case of someone who said, you know, it's been over a year. I applied for a transfer certificate and I did not get it. So he said, well, did you follow all the instructions? He said, well, they were very complicated. I did the best I could. So we said, why don't you go to an accountant and have him do it and have him do the best he can, because he probably has some experience in doing it the right way. So absolutely, when you file for a transfer certificate, get some professional help, because you don't want to find out a year later that the IRS didn't accept your initial request, and only then you're going to start to deal with it. It can take months. It can take years, frankly, to get one, but you want to start right away after someone dies. So I would say that these were the major mistakes that this guy made. He didn't deal with getting the will or dealing with an estate intestate, as if his mother had no will, because basically she didn't, because it was invalid. And at the end, he didn't even bother getting the transfer certificate. And all of this delayed the whole process for 5 years until he got the money. So let me give you a few steps of what you should be doing now to make it easier for your heirs. The first thing is to realize that having a will is a critical thing for everyone. It just makes it easier. If someone tells you, you don't need a will, let it just go by whatever the government says, the laws say, really? You want to do that? You can write a will. It's not such a major expense. It shouldn't be a big deal. Just do it with a lawyer. Make sure that you tell the lawyer what your goals are, what you're trying to do. And by the way, at the same time you're working on the will, these days, there's two other documents which I think everyone should have, and hopefully your lawyer will be able to help you out with this as well. We said a will. The second document is a power of attorney. In the event that you are not able to deal with your finances, make sure that there's someone else who's legally allowed to do it. Ultimately, if you get disabled or you have in any of a number of ways, if you get disabled, and you don't have a power of attorney, a proper power of attorney, a durable power of attorney, which means that it lasts, it'll continue even if you become disabled. Whoever your brother, your spouse, your friend will have to go to court, apply to the court to get guardianship over you. Another nightmare. Things you can easily avoid by telling your lawyer, hey, while you're writing my will, could you also work for me on a power of attorney? And at the same time, he'll probably tell you you could do a power of attorney not only for your money, but for your health care. And that's a great opportunity for you to think about what you'd like in the event that you cannot speak for yourself and that you are ill. So the lawyer you work with should be able to put together all three documents, the will, the financial power of attorney, and the healthcare power of attorney. These are the number one steps that you should take. A question that comes up a lot, and I will tell you there seem to be multiple answers on it, but I'll tell you only from my experience, not legal advice, but again, 30 years I've been dealing as a financial advisor. I think that I can tell you what we've seen. When clients in Israel pass away and they have an Israeli will only, the US is perfectly happy to accept it for their financial assets, like their brokerage accounts and their bank accounts. So we always tell the client, we'll need it in English. So if you write it in English, even better. Or when you pass away, whoever is in charge, whoever is the executor of your estate, will have to get an official translation. We need it in English, and we'll be happy to accept the Israeli probate on that. So it's not a big deal. You don't have to worry, oh, I'm going to have to go through probate in America. I need 2 wills. It's not a big process. What I'm hoping that in today's Goldstein On Gelt Show, your takeaway is, if I just follow a few simple steps, I can make sure that things will go smoothly for my heirs. Now, if your situation is more complicated, if you have real estate in different states, if you have trusts, if you have corporations, okay, those are actually more complicated and you may need a little more advice. You can start with me, right? I'm what's called a trust and estate practitioner. That's one of the certifications that I have. Trust and estate practitioners deal in this very issue, helping people to design their trusts and estates. I don't do it from a legal standpoint. I do it from the investment side, and we bring in the lawyers and the accountants to help you. If nothing else, you just want to make sure that your paperwork is in order. So that's the takeaway for today. If you're not sure, or you just want to schmooze about your assets and make sure that you think you're in the right space, I specialize in dealing with people who live in Israel, who have U.S. investment accounts, and we'd be more than happy to start a conversation with you. Feel free to call the office in Israel. Our phone number is 02-624-2788, or you can, of course, email me directly at doug@profile-financial.com. We are taking on new clients now, and the clients we work with, again, are people who live outside the United States, who have U.S. investment accounts, things like stocks and bonds, bank deposits, people who need help with that, people who have IRAs. That's the space that we work in. Thanks again. You've been listening to The Financial Show for Americans living in Israel. I'm Doug Goldstein. See you next time on the Goldstein On Gelt Show.